I am acquainted with guilt and resentment. I think probably like most people, hopefully like most people. I've done some things in my life that have certainly generated some guilt. Some things that come to my mind are sometimes how I show up as a husband and a father isn't exactly who I want to be. I think back to when I was dating in high school and early college. I don't think I always presented as the most upstanding gentleman in those kinds of situations. I think I feel some other guilt around how I quit one of my previous jobs, particularly the first real estate job I had. I really didn't quit that job with integrity. And I've also felt quite a bit of resentment. I've felt some resentment at my parents, certainly. I've felt some resentment at, I guess, the society, the structure of the world. I felt some resentment of my spouse, certainly. I imagine that's pretty normal. And it's not a common feeling. I've felt some resentment at my employers, some resentment at my employees. So guilt and resentment are feelings that I think I'm pretty well acquainted with. And I just recently learned of a structure for understanding them, understanding why they exist, how they serve us, and also a structure for letting those feelings go. And I think it's important to have a way that you move past guilt and resentment in your life, because in my experience, guilt and resentment seem to be two emotions that can really derail people and really be sort of like a toxic emotional sludge that people just kind of can't get past. Some people who I think like either drink themselves to death or kill themselves often do so because they just can't move past guilt and resentment in their life. So I'm going to present a model to you today for how I understand what guilt and resentment are and how I think you might be able to move past them so that you can have a more peaceful, loving, happy life. My name's Ryan Weiss. This is The Ryan Weiss Show. Thanks for tuning in. If you're new to the channel, I'm doing a video series here called Lessons for My Kids, where I'm producing 52 videos, one each week for a year, on some of the most important life lessons that I'd like my kids to learn. And I'm recording these videos so that if anything happens to me, these lessons will still exist and my kids can learn these lessons taught to them by their dad. And so in today's lesson, I'll be talking about guilt, resentment, and forgiveness. So I'm doing this indoors. I got my piece of paper here, and I'll start with guilt, but one of the things that I found is that guilt and resentment are very similar emotions, right? So the way that I like to understand guilt is by, let me just create like a little rainbow here. Okay, we're going to add a divider down the middle. And the way that I would suggest understanding guilt, so let me put that up top, guilt. So over here, you have your self-image. And then over here, you have the actions that you take. Hope you can see that in the video. Yeah, kind of. So you've got the actions that you take and you've got your self-image. During your life, you will take a lot of actions. And from time to time, for various reasons, you will take actions that are not in alignment with your self-image. So with my self-image, if you asked me, who do I think I am? I would say that I am honest. I would say that I am kind. I would say that I am brave. I would say that, I'm intelligent. Okay, I have a positive self-image. From time to time, I have taken actions that have not been honest, have not been kind, have not been brave, and have not been intelligent. So when you take an action, right, that doesn't align with your self-image, it can generate guilt. And this is how I would define guilt, right? So guilt is when you take an action that does not align with your self-image. So I mentioned earlier, but if we take a look at this, I consider myself to be a kind person. One of the things that generates guilt within me is how some of my initial romantic relationships went when I started dating in high school. I don't think I was always very kind. I think sometimes I said some hurtful things and I did some hurtful things. So when I take actions that appear to me to be unkind, but I think that I'm a kind person, this is what generates guilt, right? Because the reason that I know that they're not in alignment with my self-image is because if I had my self-image of being a jerk or being an unkind person, and then I took an unkind action, I really wouldn't get a lot of guilt from that, right? I'd be like, yeah, I was a jerk. I'm a jerk. Of course I would be a jerk. But guilt can occur when you have a positive self-image and you take negative actions, right? So I take guilt whenever I feel guilt as a sign that I have a positive self-image. So I take that as a plus. But then the question is, how do you resolve guilt, right? Because it's easy to ruminate and to just think, well, I say I'm kind, but then I have this evidence that I'm unkind, and so, I shouldn't have done that. I wish I didn't do that. I can't undo that, right? So it's so easy to have guilt be a trap. And I would suggest that there's really sort of two things that you can do to resolve guilt, right? So the first is you can take a look at the action side of the equation, and you could say, are there any actions that I need to take to undo this one that's generating guilt? Perhaps you need to apologize. Perhaps you need to pay some restitution. Perhaps you broke something and you need to fix it, right? It's possible that there are actions that you need to take that will that will cause you to be more in alignment with your self-image. So that's sort of the first thing. Okay, I'm feeling guilty. Is there something I need to do? The second way you can resolve guilt, so sometimes when you feel guilty, there's nothing you can do, right? Maybe the person is dead or gone, or the situation has changed, and there's nothing that you can do to change what you've done. That's where I would suggest taking a look at the self-image side of the equation. And this is where you can start to sort of work in some forgiveness, right? So if you analyze, why did I take this action that's generating guilt? Oftentimes you will have opportunities for self-compassion. Okay, so let's take another example here of something I feel guilty about. Sometimes I feel guilty for how I show up as a parent. I want to be a kind parent. Sometimes I'm a little snappy with my son. Sometimes maybe I use a tone of voice I don't want, or something like that. And I don't really show up the way I want to, and that can generate some guilt within me. There are certainly actions I can take to resolve that, and I do from time to time. I'll apologize to my son. Hey, sorry, I was a little rough there, or, I'm whatever. But then on the self-image side, an example of what I could do there is I could say, okay, I was kind of rough with my son. Why did I do that? Well, I am working a lot. I'm really stressed. I didn't sleep good. I didn't feel good. The particular thing that he did triggered me in a certain way. I'm very sensitive to those kinds of particular things. And so, this is something that I really struggle with, right? Because I really don't want to make excuses, and I don't want to excuse poor behavior. But I think it is important to work in some self-compassion and to give yourself permission to have reasons to do things that aren't in alignment with your self-image. And this can help, and this can sort of allow you to give yourself compassion and say, okay, I did this thing I didn't want to do. There are reasons that I did that, and ultimately I forgive myself. And it's not easy, right? I have a definition of forgiveness that I'll share with you. So forgiveness, right? So forgiveness is the realization that everyone makes mistakes, but nobody is a mistake. So forgiveness is the realization that everyone makes mistakes, but nobody is a mistake. And there's some layered meanings to that I suggest you sort of ponder about. What this means to me is everyone makes mistakes. So at some point, I'm going to do things that I don't mean to do. They don't represent the best versions of me. And I'm going to have some actions that I take that generate guilt. but I am not a mistake, right? I'm here for a reason. I have a purpose, and my worst actions do not represent who I really am. I want to take a moment to take a look at resentment. Now, for resentment, I'm going to draw a similar bow. And we're going to do actions. And then here, I'm going to write other image. So there's a couple different things, that can generate resentment. But what I would suggest resentment is you have this image of how things should be, whether this is people, whether this is situations, experiences, right? So an example is if you have a bad vacation, that can cause some resentment. I have this image of how a vacation should be, right? A vacation should be relaxing, it should be rejuvenating, it should be fun. And then if I go on a vacation and I'm stressed, I'm panicked, I don't sleep well, I don't feel good, someone is causing me harm, that could absolutely generate some resentment within me. What the hell? I paid for this vacation, I was expecting this, and I got that, right? So you have this image, this positive image of how things should be, and then you have this action of how things actually are. Now, a vacation is intangible and non-personal. We can make it personal, right? So you probably have parents if you're watching this. I have this expectation or this image that my parents should be loving. I don't know about you, but at some points in my childhood, my parents did not act the most loving. Now, this can generate some resentment, right? Because I expect them to be this way, then they are actually acting this way. And that to me is what triggers resentment. Now, with resentment, there's a couple different ways that you can resolve it. And like guilt, in my experience, you can either work on the action side of the equation, or you can work on the image side of the equation. So someone takes an action or something happens that does not align with your self-image, or with your other image. Is there some action that you need to take to bring the situation or person back into how you expect them to be? So going back to the parent example, right? My dad says something that's hurtful. I expect him to be kind and loving. At that point, I could take an action with my dad and say, hey, Dad, you just said this thing or did this thing that I perceived to be hurtful. I wanted to let you know, and I wanted to hear what you think about this. Why did you do this? Let's talk about this. And, in my experience, with my dad, if I have that conversation, he'd probably say something like, oh, thank you for telling me. I didn't intend for it to be hurtful. I didn't know it would be hurtful. I didn't mean it. I was in XYZ state. And by having that conversation with him, his image of being a good, loving father is restored, right? Let's take the vacation example. Okay, I expect my vacation to be good. My vacation actually sucks. Is there an action I can take? Well, in that case, maybe there isn't an action you can take, right? That's kind of an interesting one. If the vacation sucked and you expected it to be good, there's nothing you can do. So the other way you can work on resentment is by going to the image side of the equation and seeing if you can introduce some parts of your image of how things are or should be, or how people are or should be, and introduce a little bit of kindness, a little bit of forgiveness, and a little bit of compassion for other people. So I expected my vacation to be good. My vacation sucked. Well, why did I expect my vacation to be good? I mean, there are some parts of going on a vacation that are out of your control. So maybe in the image of how your vacation should be, you can introduce, the possibility that it won't go exactly according to plan. And I don't know about you, but when I anticipate that things might not go exactly the way that I want them to, when they go the way that I don't want them to, I feel a little bit more peaceful in that situation, right? Bringing it back to my dad as an example, okay, I have this image of my dad being a kind and loving dad, but can I also hold in this image that sometimes he gets a little stressed out? Can I also hold in this image that sometimes he doesn't sleep well? And sometimes my dad, he's kind and loving, but can I introduce some compassion for him that maybe sometimes he takes actions that are not in alignment with his self-image? I think so. I think I can do that. So that's sort of the model that I use for guilt and resentment. This is one of my favorite definitions of forgiveness. And what I would suggest to you is if you are feeling any guilt or if you are feeling any resentment, consider this model. Consider, are you taking actions that don't align with your self-image? Are things happening that aren't aligning with your expectations for how they should be? And then are there any actions you can take, or are there any changes that you can make to your self-image or to your perception of how things should be? And I'll just close with, again, one of my favorite definitions of forgiveness, which is the realization that everyone makes mistakes, but nobody is a mistake. So thanks very much for watching. I hope that was helpful. This is Ryan Weiss with The Ryan Weiss Show, signing out.